This is City Focus, the podcast from the League of Oregon Cities, where we explore the issues that matter to cities across Oregon.
Welcome to City Focus. On this episode, I'm joined in the studio by Katie Kammer, pre-loss attorney and host of Kammersations, the podcast for CIS. Katie joins me for a conversation about the laws that protect employees against harassment, discrimination, and retaliation. Katie is an engaging speaker on this topic, and our conversation focuses on encouraging elected officials to think about what is appropriate versus inappropriate in the workplace. We also look at what the current laws are and also what's expected in the modern workplace. Katie, welcome to City Focus.
Thank you for having me.
So we're going to talk about harassment and discrimination laws, but how they apply to elected officials more specifically.
Really what I want to talk about today is the way in which an elected official has a role in carrying out the prohibitions on harassment and discrimination for the entity that they were elected to govern. I think a lot of times elected officials come to their position with the city with a great platform, objectives that they want to reach, and they don't think about how the employee side of that, how they will need to interact with employees, how they can support the city as an employer in carrying out their legal obligations. So CIS and the LOC do a lot of training on this issue in terms of educating elected officials and arming them with the knowledge and the tools to make sure that they're supporting their entity and carrying out their legal obligations for preventing harassment and discrimination. So that's what I wanted to talk about today.
Okay. And so that's how it relates from the elected official relating to the city employee. Can you, are there levels of conduct that you need to be looking at for an elected official, certain zones, for lack of a better term?
Well, kind of. So what I really wanted to talk about is three different areas that an elected official can focus their attention when it comes to these laws. So the first issue would be just in general understanding what the laws are and making sure that you have a good grasp on that. So the standard is that an employer has an obligation under Oregon and federal law to make sure that the workplace is harassment-free and discrimination-free, and that employees are not suffering harassment and discrimination when they come to work. And that protection is covers employees interacting with each other. Employees cannot harass each other or discriminate against each other. It also protects employees from vendors, independent contractors, or, an IT consultant who comes in cannot harass a city employee. And then it also protects the employees from interactions with citizens. So if a citizen were to come in and say, I don't want to work with the person at the front desk because of their race, so please find me another employee with a different race. That would be problematic under the laws and the policies of your organization, most likely. So elected officials need to know about that, those prohibitions. And if they have questions about that, they should look at the policies in the employee handbook for their entity.
Okay.
And if you don't know where those are, then you can ask your city official, city manager, city administrator, and they will point them to you.
I would think new city officials coming in, that would be part of their training. I mean, for a lot of these people, there is a steep learning curve. First-time city councilors, there's not a lot of preparation for something like this on the outside. You're bringing your skill set to it, but I would think that would be part of the training, is to get your elected officials up to speed on what the rules and regulations are within that organization.
Ideally, that would be great, because as an elected official for the entity, you want to have a general awareness of all the operations of the entity that you're representing. So there's a little, a crossover there, an issue that can trip elected officials up, because most charters limit the authority of an elected official in terms of managing personnel issues. Elected officials for a city are typically only in charge of personnel matters related to the city manager or the city attorney. And then usually management of city employees is delegated to the city manager or the city administrator. So you may not on the first day be given the employee handbook because, we don't want to confuse you and say, oh, you need to be involved in carrying out and enforcing these policies. That's not what we want you to do necessarily, unless that's specifically, one of your responsibilities.
But they do interact with staff.
Yes. And so that's why it is very important to have a general knowledge of, the guidelines, how we're expecting employees to interact with each other, what are the standards that we're holding them to, and then help, having the elected official be able to help carry those out, make sure that, they're aware of what the status is.
So by the very nature of the role of sort of Salem City Council, Kaiser City Council, Ontario City Council, whatever, you've got elected officials. Do you sometimes have instances where a staff will go to a city councilor to maybe try to find a remedy for an issue that they're facing, maybe not realizing that may not be the best way? So what does a city councilor do when that scenario happens?
That's the key to the key issue where this comes up is really because an elected official is in a position of authority. Employees may have relationships with that city official because of working on a commission together or interacting, helping carry out projects. An employee may come to the elected official and in the course of a conversation start discussing issues that, actually, are concerned about harassment or discrimination. The employee may say, hey, my coworker is making these kinds of comments and I don't find them appropriate and I don't know what to do. And the elected official needs to be aware of how to respond in that situation. The key thing for an elected official to know is that once you have information about that problematic behavior occurring, your knowledge is now the knowledge of the organization. Your knowledge is imputed to the organization. So if you don't take the appropriate steps to take that complaint back to HR or back to the city manager, then that complaint potentially could fall through the cracks. And down the road, the employee could say, they could file a claim and they could say, no, I brought this issue to the attention of the city. I told the elected officials 6 months ago, a year ago, that I was suffering harassment in the workplace and nothing ever happened to it. So the elected official needs to know, yes, employees may come to you and bring that information forward, and you need to look in your entity's policy about how complaints are addressed within your organization. Frequently, it's if you're lucky to have a human resources personnel, the complaints should be directed to that person. And then the elected official has done their duty. They can wash their hands of the situation because they've put it into the hands of the people who understand how to address the complaint. If you're ever in doubt about whether a conversation that you've had with an employee rises to the level of a complaint about harassment and discrimination, I say, when in doubt, find out. Take it to the city manager, take it to the HR professional and say, this is the information that I got, and I want to just turn it over to you. Those individuals within your entity are trained on how to identify whether it's an issue that needs an investigation, it needs an informal follow-up. They'll know what to do. But it shouldn't be on the elected official to carry that forward. And in fact, a lot of times it's not your responsibility as an elected official to look into those kind of complaints because, as I mentioned before, the city charter often limits your authority with regard to personnel matters. So, handing it over to HR and the city manager is more appropriate. And actually, it just protects you as well. Because as an elected official, you're subject to public records laws, public meeting laws. And if you go ahead and do an investigation or follow into a matter, then, you may have the issue of your efforts being subject to, disclosure. And oftentimes you don't know the background. So it's better to put it into somebody else's hands. And I say that to protect the elected official, take it off your to-do list.
It seems fraught with danger to do anything but what you just recommended.
Right.
And again, you're doing your duty. You've got that information. You're handing it over to the people that can take care of it. That to me seems basically common sense to me. That's what that seems like.
Yeah, I think it can sneak up on you because these conversations don't often come in a written format with complaint written in bold letters across the top. It could be an informal conversation at the drugstore or at your, if you have kids on the same Little League team. And it can be a very informal, indirect conversation, but you can hear a few key words. For instance, if the employee is raising a protected status, I don't think I'm being treated equally because of my gender. Okay. Or I feel like I'm losing out on job responsibilities because of my age. Or this medical event happened to me, and ever since then, I haven't been treated the same. That is the kind of thing that can slip into a normal conversation, but can also have legal ramifications for your organization. So that's what I say, it's best to find out, to just move those over to HR.
Yeah, when in doubt. Yeah, you're right, because it could be something is two friends commiserating about something is different than the examples that you just said, which would, I think for most people, especially today, pop a little red flag up in there where you'd go, and maybe want to turn that over. You guys, CIS, there's anecdotes out where this has come up where it's not been handled properly. Do you have any cautionary tales or anything you can share with our listeners as far as, when this happens, don't do this, do this? Anything you can share that way?
Well, I would say that the two things that happen most frequently are overlooking it or diminishing the complaint and hoping that if you stick your head in the sand, it'll go away. And I will tell you that most of the time it won't go away. Yeah. So we do have situations where a employee will come to a city manager or a elected official and make some complaints, and then the elected official thinks this isn't my responsibility and I don't want to get involved in the drama and I don't want to spread rumors. So I'm just going to that's not my job. I know I'm not involved with personnel matters. I'm just going to keep it to myself. And that can create a problem because the complaint falls through the crack and then the employee down the road will file a claim.
That seems to me like that should be communication, because I don't know whether the elected official might feel like they're breaching a confidence versus getting, this specifically saying, yes, please go take this too. Would that be a conversation you would recommend they have? As if you're unsure, to get clarification from the person you're having the conversation with before you go forward, or to assume? I'm seeing assumptions potentially being made that could be dangerous.
Well, so I think an elected official can always say to the person who's raising that concern, some of the things you're saying to me raise a little bit red flag. Can you give me a little bit more information? And you can also, if you have the knowledge of your entity's policies, you can refer them to that policy and say, look, in this policy, it talks about who are the appropriate people to carry out, to address your concerns. So let's go talk to that person. But it also, it can be a situation where even if you say to the person, you need to go talk to HR, the elected official still needs to follow up and just say, I want to let you know that I had this conversation. I referred them back to you, HR, but I just wanted to let you know to, loop that back up.
Okay, so that makes sense. But yeah, you talk where you're running into somebody at the deli counter and they make a conversation, or the friendship relationships, that there's a bit of grayness in there. And so it behooves, I think, electeds and staff to be really clear on what that is.
Well, and we tell supervisors and elected officials the same thing. You're, by nature of your position with the entity, you never really take that hat off. You're never off duty when it comes to being an elected official. People know who you are. They know that you have authority within your organization, so they're going to come to you at any time, and you really need to be prepared at any time.
Yeah, that's true. They are never off the clock, no matter. It's kind of like the doctor. Hey, can you take a look at this for me? You're never off the clock.
Yeah.
Well, before we wrap up, what would you suggest as far as from CIS, from your perspective, if anybody listening to this has questions, if they've had something like this come up, is there resources for them outside, maybe a broader resource than their city's charter, to kind of get a leg up on, best practices, and if something like this happens to you?
if your entity is a member of CIS, we have online trainings about the underlying laws, harassment and discrimination, and that might help you identify the buzzwords.
Yeah.
We also have trainings that are directed more at supervisors about how to receive a complaint, but I think that would be an excellent resource for an elected official who may feel like they get caught off guard with comments or conversations and how to respond to those. So that's another option. And then I know that LOC and CIS team up together for educating new elected officials. And so there are trainings that are provided to entities to get them aware of the scope of their authority and what they should be doing. And then, of course, if you've got questions, I'm available. People can call me. They can also call my boss, Tamara Jones, who's the other pre-loss attorney and the Deputy General Counsel of CIS. And we are here. The one last thing I want to say, and this is, I think it goes without saying, you were saying this is kind of a common sense topic.
Yeah.
But once you are aware as an elected official of the policies that apply to your entity and the employees that work there, think about those standards kind of as a guideline for your own conduct, because people are watching you as an elected official for setting the tone of what is appropriate. So, for instance, in a policy, it may talk about sexual harassment, for instance, and say that inappropriate non-consensual touching is not allowed within the entity. Yeah. That, as an elected official, you should be complying with that. Not going up. You may be a hugger and you may want to go up and everybody you meet, give them a hug. Well, that is not always approved of by the person you're hugging. So think about that. Any kind of touching, pinching cheeks, patting people on the head. Another thing that elected officials forget about is just by nature of their position in the entity, people aren't always comfortable telling them, I didn't find that joke very funny, or I don't feel comfortable getting a hug. So you've already got to think about how your role in the entity may impact the reaction you get from people. So one story I have is an elected official who found an off-color joke really, really funny. And he went in and he was telling all of the staff in the front office this sexual joke. And people were giggling because of discomfort. Sure. And no one told him, don't tell us those jokes. Right. And because he thought he had an audience, he made it his job to go find other inappropriate jokes. And he would come back and tell them. Now, that didn't luckily end up in a claim, but I'll tell you how it can end up in a claim. If you continue to engage in that kind of conduct and it makes someone so uncomfortable that they try to avoid seeing you and hearing your jokes, and in avoiding you, they avoid doing their job responsibilities, and they then get in trouble for not doing their job responsibilities, they could say, well, I'm not doing my job responsibilities because I'm in a hostile work environment. And if the entity doesn't take appropriate quick steps to stop that hostile work environment, and they discipline the employee for the work performance issues, we could be resulting in a claim because the employee is saying, you have an obligation, employer, to make sure I work in a harassment-free workplace. You're not doing that. And so I'm suffering a negative employment action because I raised this concern. Wow. So, elected officials, be setting good role, be a good role model, be the standard for appropriate conduct in your entity. And in part of doing that, making sure that when you hear about harassment or discrimination that might be going on, make sure you carry it back to your entity so it can be handled appropriately.
Sounds like a little forethought on the front end of that can help not let any of what you described happen at all.
I want to talk to you at a conference in a jovial situation. If you have to call me for a pre-loss matter, it can be more stressful. So I don't want you to have to call me unless it's for preventative measures or a friendly chat.
Right. That sounds good. This is very, very good advice. Again, a lot of it is common sense. And I think being a little bit mindful of what you're doing and setting an example as being in a leadership role in your community is all great advice. So once again, I've been talking to Katie Kammer from CIS. She's CIS pre-loss attorney. And Katie, thank you so much for coming on City Focus.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of City Focus. Check out show notes for links to Katie's contact information at CIS, and be sure to reach out to her if you have questions about the topics that we covered today. My name is Denise Nanke, and I'm the host and producer of City Focus, the podcast from the League of Oregon Cities. The League is a governmental entity formed to work with our members to help local government better serve the citizens of Oregon. LOC strives to be the go-to place for Oregon cities as a resource hub for advocacy, education, and best practices. While our focus is Oregon and Oregon issues, we realize that we have many issues in common across the country. We hope that this podcast will reach beyond the borders of our state to share ideas and solutions. If you have suggestions for topics or comments about any of our podcasts, send me an email at cityfocus@orcities.org. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and be sure to subscribe to this podcast to get notification when we publish new content.